Keyword intro reveal, Washtub. In 1951, an FBI agent walked into a cabin in the Alaskan interior and offered a bush pilot a job. He could not be told the name of the operation. He could not tell his wife. He could not even tell the other Alaska bush pilots that this conversation had happened. What the FBI was building in the wilderness north of Anchorage was an army. 89 private American citizens, pilots, trappers, miners, and natives of the Aleutian Islands were quietly recruited, secretly trained, and given weapons caches buried across the Alaskan tundra. If the Soviet Union invaded Alaska, and in 1951, the United States military genuinely believed this was a question of when, not if. These civilians would be the resistance. For 63 years, the operation did not appear in any congressional record. The agents did not know each other's identities. Some of them died, never having told their families that they had once been, by oath, members of a clandestine American counter-occupation force. The name of the operation was Washtub, and the file was opened to the public by accident in 2014. In 1951, Alaska was not a state. It was a strategic problem. The territory shared a border across the Bering Strait with the most powerful land army in the world. It had 3 modern airfields, a handful of poorly equipped soldiers, and roughly 130,000 civilians, most of them concentrated in 2 cities. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had moved its long-range bomber bases into eastern Siberia. The flight time from Anadyr to Fairbanks was 4 hours. The flight time from Anadyr to Seattle was 8. Senior officers in the U.S. Air Force, the Army, and the FBI agreed on 3 things. First, the Soviets had the capability to invade Alaska. Second, the United States lacked the troops to repel them. Third, if such an invasion occurred, there would be no way to evacuate the civilian population. What was needed, the planners concluded, was not a defense, but an underground. A network of trusted civilians embedded in Alaska's small towns and remote outposts who could continue the war by other means. People who knew the terrain. People the Soviets would never identify as soldiers. It needed a cover. It needed a budget. And it needed, above all, men nobody would suspect. The men the FBI began approaching in the winter of 1951 were not strangers. They were already half-mythical figures of the Alaskan North. Robert Campbell Reeve had founded Reeve Aleutian Airways in 1932. He had spent 2 decades flying mining equipment to outposts that lacked roads, runways, and sometimes maps. He was 49 years old, a heavy drinker, and a man who knew the names of every fuel cache between Anchorage and the western Aleutians. The FBI signed him. After Reeve, more pilots were approached. Through the pilots, trappers, and miners. Through the miners, men who had been guides and translators in the Aleutian Islands during the Second World War. Men who spoke fluent Unangan, the Aleut language, and who knew which Aleutian villages had been resettled by Soviet sympathizers and which had not. By 1953, 89 agents had been recruited. By signed oath, each one had agreed to memorize the location of 3 weapons caches, operate a portable radio set under combat conditions, recognize Soviet uniforms, ranks, and unit insignia by sight, carry out specified acts of sabotage on demand, conceal indefinitely the existence of the operation from family, friends, and any United States authority outside their direct handler. They were called stay-behind agents, and the official internal code name for the program was Washtub. 89 agents are an army only if they are equipped. In the summers of 1952 through 1958, FBI and U.S. Air Force teams flew supply runs into roughly 200 locations across the territory. The locations were chosen for 3 properties. They had to be reachable on foot. They had to be invisible from the air. And they had to be far enough from established Soviet flight paths that surface reconnaissance would not, by accident, find them. Inside each cache, The inventory was identical. Portable shortwave radio, frequency tuned and sealed. One Smith & Wesson revolver, one Colt 1911 pistol, one Winchester carbine, a small quantity of plastic explosive, ration tins, a compass, a printed copy of the agent's escape codes sewn into the lining of a waterproof envelope, 200 caches, 800 firearms, roughly 6 tons of equipment buried across an area the size of Italy. The men who placed each cache did not know the location of any other. It was, by deliberate design, an army that could only be reassembled by a war. The operation had a second purpose, smaller but more controversial than the first. While the stay-behind network was being assembled, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover requested a separate authority. He wanted the same network, the same agents, the same radios, the same caches, to also be used to identify and report on suspected communist sympathizers within Alaska itself. This was not a defensive measure. It was a domestic intelligence operation against American citizens dressed inside a military one. Internal memoranda from the early 1950s, declassified in 2014, show that the U.S. Air Force was uneasy. The Air Force was a foreign intelligence service. Domestic political surveillance was the FBI's job. To combine the two functions in one network, to have a man with an explosive cache also be the man reporting on his neighbor's reading habits, was the kind of thing the United States had spent the previous decade fighting against abroad. A compromise was reached. The stay-behind function remained jointly USAF and FBI. The internal surveillance function remained strictly FBI. The agents themselves, in many cases, were never told which of the two roles they were playing. In the language of the internal files, this was described as operational discretion. By 1959, the world that Washtub had been built to defend had stopped existing. The Soviets did not invade Alaska. They built intercontinental missiles. The threat of a ground invasion across the Bering Strait, which had seemed urgent in 1951, was, by the late 50s, an artifact of a previous strategic age. The 89 agents were quietly stood down. Their oaths remained in force. Their caches remained buried. Their identities were known only to a single handler in Anchorage and to the inspector in charge of the FBI field office. The handlers retired. The Anchorage office was reorganized. The files were classified at a level so high that, by the 1970s, no one outside the original participants knew the operation had ever existed. Some of the caches were dug up by accident in the 80s and 90s, by hikers, by mining surveyors, by snow machine trails cutting through the brush. Each one was reported to local police. None of the reports ever made it back to the FBI inventory, because the inventory itself was filed under a code name that nobody alive remembered. In 1996, a hunter near Mount Susitna found a rusted ammunition can containing a shortwave radio, a Colt 1911, and a piece of waterproof paper printed with rows of letters and numbers. We gave it to the local sheriff. The sheriff gave it to the state archives. It sat in a box for 18 years. In 2014, a researcher named David Bjork filed a routine Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI. He was looking for material on the early history of the Bureau's Anchorage field office. He expected, at best, a few pages of administrative records. What he received was nearly 3,000 pages of declassified material on a previously unknown operation called Washtub. The cover sheet of the file used a phrase that had not been seen in unclassified American history before that morning. Stay Behind Agent Program, Territory of Alaska. It became a small news item. A retired pilot in Anchorage, contacted by reporters, said he had been one of the agents. He confirmed the names of 2 others. Both were dead. The remaining 86 identities by FBI policy have never been released. Most of them by now are also dead. In 2025, the question of what the United States is willing to do in the Arctic returned, briefly and loudly, to the front pages of the world's newspapers. New flight paths, new bases, new conversations about Greenland and the polar routes. The instinct that produced Washtub. The instinct that says prepare the civilians for an occupation we cannot stop is a quiet instinct, but it is not a historical one. Somewhere under the snow north of Anchorage, in roughly 190 unfound caches, the equipment of an army that never fought is still waiting to be issued. The file is technically closed.